There's a road that runs from Chicago to Los Angeles. 2,448 miles of asphalt and concrete and gravel and dirt, crossing 8 states, 3 time zones, and the full width of the American continent from the shore of Lake Michigan to the shore of the Pacific Ocean. Today, it is a nostalgic artifact, a tourist route, a heritage designation, a symbol of a particular American mythology about freedom and motion in the open road. Vintage diners and neon signs and restored gas stations attract visitors from around the world who come to experience something they have seen in photographs and films and heard about in songs. But in the 1930s, Route 66 was not a nostalgic artifact. It was not a symbol. It was a lifeline. The most important road in America during the most desperate decade in American history. A strip of imperfect pavement that carried hundreds of thousands of people westward through the Depression and the Dust Bowl, people who had lost everything and were driving toward the only direction that seemed to offer anything at all. To understand what Route 66 was in the 1930s, before the mythology, before the television show, before the song, you have to understand the America it ran through, and that America was in crisis. Route 66 was officially designated on November 11th, 1926, assigned its number by the newly formed U.S. highway system, which was attempting to bring order to a chaotic national road network that had grown without coordination or consistent standards. The number 66 was not the first choice of its boosters. Cyrus Avery, an Oklahoma businessman and road advocate who had done more than any other individual to bring the route into existence, had lobbied for the number 60, which he felt carried more prestige. He lost that argument to Kentucky, whose highway advocates wanted the number for a different route. Avery settled for 66, and the double digit turned out to carry a resonance that 60 never would have. A rhythm in the mouth, a visual symmetry on the highway signs, a sound that would eventually embed itself in American culture with a tenacity that no highway planner in 1926 could have anticipated. The road that received the designation in 1926 was not, in any meaningful engineering sense, a finished highway. Large sections of it were unpaved, dirt tracks that turned to impassable mud in rain and a choking dust and drought. The pavement that did exist varied dramatically in quality from state to state and county to county, reflecting the financial priorities and engineering standards of dozens of different local jurisdictions. Bridges were inadequate or absent in places. Drivers crossed some rivers by ford, driving through shallow water and hoping the riverbed was firm enough to support the weight of their vehicle. The signage was inconsistent. The maps were unreliable. Driving Route 66 in the late 1920s was an adventure in the literal sense, an undertaking whose outcome was genuinely uncertain, requiring mechanical competence, physical endurance, and a tolerance for conditions that would be considered unacceptable by any modern standard of road travel. The communities along the route in the late 1920s and early 1930s were a cross-section of American geography and American economic life. In Illinois, the road ran through Chicago's South Side and then southwest through the small industrial cities of Joliet and Bloomington and Springfield. The state capital, Abraham Lincoln City, a place of government buildings and courthouse squares, and the particular Midwestern civic architecture of the early 20th century. In Missouri, it crossed the Ozark Plateau through towns like Cuba and Rolla and Springfield, a different Springfield, a different scale, a rougher and more rural landscape than the Illinois flatlands. In Oklahoma, it passed through Tulsa and Oklahoma City, cities that had grown explosively on oil money in the 1920s and were about to discover how completely that growth depended on conditions that could not be sustained. In Texas, it crossed the narrow Panhandle, 60 miles of flat, windswept grassland that in the 1930s would become part of the worst environmental disaster in American history. In New Mexico and Arizona, it traversed landscapes of such geological drama. Red rock mesas, painted desert, the corridor through Albuquerque, and then west through Gallup toward the Arizona border. That travelers who had never seen the American Southwest were frequently stopped in their tracks by the sheer visual impact of what surrounded them. And in California, it descended from the Mojave Desert through the Cajon Pass and into the Los Angeles Basin, ending at the Santa Monica Pier on the Pacific Ocean. The depression that began with the stock market crash of October 1929 transformed Route 66 from a regional road into a national institution. The economic collapse of the early 1930s was not evenly distributed across the American landscape. It fell hardest on the people who had the least, and it fell catastrophically on the agricultural regions of the Great Plains, where a combination of economic depression and environmental catastrophe produced a human crisis of a scale that the United States had never experienced in peacetime. The Dust Bowl, the result of decades of deep plowing of the Great Plains grasslands combined with the severe drought that began in 1931 and intensified through the mid-1930s, destroyed the agricultural economy of a region stretching across Oklahoma, Kansas, Colorado, Texas, and New Mexico. The topsoil that generations of farming had cultivated was picked up by the wind and carried in massive black clouds. Dust storms that could turn day into night, that buried fence posts and filled farmhouses with fine black grit, that suffocated livestock and caused a respiratory illness called dust pneumonia that killed children and elderly people across the affected region. The families who left the Dust Bowl in the 1930s were not primarily from Oklahoma. Though Oklahoma became the symbolic center of the migration, and the word Okie, originally a neutral geographic term, became a designation loaded with contempt by the time the migrants reached California. They came from across the affected states: Kansas farmers, Texas sharecroppers, Colorado ranchers, New Mexico subsistence farmers, all of them driven by the same combination of failed crops, foreclosed mortgages, and the simple arithmetic of survival that said there was nothing left where they were and something, possibly, somewhere to the west. They loaded what they could onto whatever vehicle they owned or could borrow: Model A Fords and Chevrolet trucks, their beds piled with furniture and bedding and tools, and the irreducible personal objects that people carry when they know they're not coming back. And they drove to Route 66 and turned west. The road they drove west on in the mid-1930s was still not fully paved. Oklahoma and Texas, the states through which the migration was heaviest, had sections of Route 66 that remained dirt or gravel, conditions that turned treacherous in rain, that shredded tires on vehicles already running on balled rubber, that added hours and mechanical breakdowns to journeys that were already desperate. The migrants who broke down on Route 66, and many did, regularly, were stranded in the desert or on the plains with limited mechanical knowledge, limited tools, and limited money to pay for repairs they could not make themselves. The small towns along the route developed an ambivalent relationship with the migrant stream passing through them. Some townspeople offered help: water, food, mechanical assistance, from genuine human sympathy for people in obvious distress. Others saw the migrants as a threat to jobs, to public resources, to social order, and responded with hostility that occasionally became organized. Arizona and California both established checkpoints at their borders at various points during the decade, attempting to control the flow of migrants into their states, an extra-legal practice that had no clear constitutional basis, but reflected the fear and resentment that the scale of the migration had generated. John Steinbeck drove Route 66 in 1937, moving west with the migrants he was observing and interviewing for the novel he was writing. The Grapes of Wrath, published in 1939, called Route 66 the Mother Road, a phrase that became the most enduring literary designation any American highway has ever received, more evocative and more accurate than any official name. The Mother Road, a road that carried people not toward opportunity, but away from catastrophe, westward on the last available option, the final direction remaining when every other option had been exhausted. Steinbeck's portrait of the Joad family's journey from Oklahoma to California along Route 66 was not purely documentary. It was a novel, and its characters were composite and constructed. But the landscape they moved through, the towns they stopped in, the roadside camps where they slept, the agricultural labor camps of California where they arrived, all of these were drawn from Steinbeck's direct observation, and they captured something true about the experience of Route 66 in the 1930s that no purely factual account has quite equaled. The roadside economy that developed along Route 66 in the 1930s was a direct response to the needs of the people traveling it. Gas stations appeared first. because a car without fuel was simply stopped, and the distances between towns in the western sections of the route made fuel supply a matter of genuine urgency. The early gas stations along Route 66 were often simple operations, a pump or two beside a converted house or a small wooden building, operated by a family that sold gasoline and motor oil and perhaps a few basic supplies. As traffic increased, the operations grew more elaborate. Garages added mechanics. Mechanics added tow trucks. Tow trucks added the ability to respond to breakdowns in the stretches of road between towns, a service that the migration made extremely profitable because the vehicles the migrants were driving were old, overloaded, and maintained to a standard that guaranteed a certain rate of mechanical failure per 100 miles. The roadside diner was Route 60 SIX's most enduring architectural contribution to American culture, and its development in the 1930s followed the logic of necessity with a directness that later nostalgia has softened but not entirely obscured. Travelers needed to eat. The towns along the route could not always provide restaurants in sufficient number or at the right locations. The distances between communities in New Mexico, Arizona, and the Mojave Desert made waiting for a town an impractical strategy for managing hunger. The solution was the roadside establishment, a diner or cafe or lunch counter positioned not in a town center, but directly on the highway, catching traffic as it passed rather than requiring travelers to detour into a downtown. These establishments were typically small, operated by families, serving food that was simple, filling, and priced for customers who had very little money. A bowl of chili or a plate of eggs, and toast for a dime. Coffee for a nickel. The menus were constrained by what could be kept without refrigeration in a desert climate and prepared quickly by a single cook on a short-order grill. The tourist court, the predecessor of the motel, developed along Route 66 in the 1930s as the overnight accommodation solution for travelers who could not afford hotels and were not camping by the side of the road. A tourist court was a collection of small individual cabins, each with a bed and perhaps a bathroom, arranged in a U or L shape around a central parking area so that guests could park directly in front of their cabin. The architecture was simple to the point of austerity, wood frame construction, minimal finishing, functional furniture, but the privacy and the roof and the bed represented a significant improvement over sleeping in the car or in a tent, and at 50 cents or $1 a night, they were accessible to travelers of very modest means. The owners of tourist courts along Route 66 were typically local families who had built the cabins on land adjacent to their homes, supplementing their income from farming or other work with the revenue from travelers. The relationship between owner and guest was personal and direct in a way that later motel chains would deliberately standardize and thereby eliminate. The Native American communities whose land Route 66 crossed were participants in the road's economy in ways that the standard Route 66 narrative has frequently reduced to stereotype. The Navajo Nation, whose territory the highway traversed for significant distances in New Mexico and Arizona, adapted to the new economic reality of automobile tourism with the same pragmatism that had characterized Navajo cultural response to external change for centuries. Trading posts along the route sold Navajo textiles, silver jewelry, and pottery to travelers who wanted souvenirs of the Southwest. Objects whose authenticity was variably guaranteed by the trading post operators who positioned themselves as intermediaries between Navajo artisans and Anglo tourists. The transactions were not always fair, and the image of Native American culture that Route 66 tourism promoted was selective and often distorted, emphasizing the picturesque and the marketable over the complex and the contemporary. But the economic relationship was real, and the income it generated for Navajo families in a decade of general economic catastrophe was not negligible. By the late 1930s, the most desperate phase of the Dust Bowl migration was ending. The rains returned to the Great Plains after 1938, ending the worst of the drought. The New Deal programs of the Roosevelt administration had introduced agricultural support systems that reduced the economic vulnerability of farming families. The migrants who had reached California found conditions that were not as immediately welcoming as they had hoped. The agricultural labor camps of the San Joaquin Valley were crowded and poorly managed. The wages were low, and the hostility of established Californians toward the new arrivals was persistent and sometimes violent. But some of the migrants found work, found housing, found a foothold in a new place. And the road they had traveled to get there, the 2,000 miles of pavement and dirt that had carried them from Oklahoma and Texas and Kansas through the desert and over the mountains, had changed in the traveling of it. It was no longer simply a highway. It was the road that America had taken during its worst decade. The physical path of a migration that reshaped the demographics and the culture of California and left its mark on American literature, American music, and the American understanding of what it meant to pack everything you owned into a vehicle and drive toward an uncertain West. The mythology of Route 66 was not invented by the song or the television show or the tourist industry. It was built by the people who drove it when driving it was the last available option. They made it the mother road. Everything that came after was just remembering.